Well, let's go ahead and review what we talked about last week. Was it last week or did we? No, yeah, last week. Last week we got to, for the most part, finish up our discussion of slavery in chapter 21. There's like one more little section that we'll have to deal with, but it's not a comfortable one, but we'll get to it. Hey, um, we went through verse 7, verse 7 through verse 10. Excuse me, verse 11. We examined verse 7 through verse 11, and that deals with when a man sells his daughter as a slave. And so we talked about how that doesn't make us comfortable. And we talked about a lot how none of this really makes us comfortable. But largely what makes us uncomfortable is the cultural disconnect that we have with the Bible. So we talked about how a man selling his daughter as a slave was not an uncommon practice, culturally speaking, for that time and that area of the world. It was a common practice, and not only for financial reasons, but for the particular situation that this law is covering, right? The law says when a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the males do, if she does not please her master who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has broken faith with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as a daughter. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. And if he does not do these three things for her, she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. Essentially, the situation is this: when a man sells his daughter as a slave with the intention for her to marry the person who has purchased this right, then this is the way he's supposed to carry it on, right? This is the way and for a man to sell his daughter as a slave is how she begins her relationship with that family, typically speaking. And then when she comes of the age at which they've agreed for her to be married, then she will no longer be the slave. She will be the married person as a part of that house. Now, we may not like it because it's not the way we look at marriage, and it's not the way that it's not the reasons for which we marry. Because in our culture, we marry, quote unquote, only for love, right? That's the only reason to get married in our culture, virtually. Right? But that's a very unusual and a very recent development in society. And we talked about this at length, where for most of history, people got married for a lot of different reasons, and very few of them were for love or affection. Most of the time, a man married his daughter off to someone wealthier than himself so that the whole family would benefit, and so that the daughter would find security and provision, and her children would have security and provision, right? It was a way to provide a safe and stable life for your child. And especially since daughters were generally married at the time they were able to have children, which a girl's able to have children, 13, 14, sometimes as young as 12. And so they would be married at that age because we're not going to live very long, so we better get on this whole having children thing as soon as we can, right? And so a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old girl will not necessarily be the best judge of who she should marry, of who is going to be a good provider for the long haul. And so it was dependent on the father to make that choice for his children. Now, once again, we don't like that because in America, we have a different set of cultural norms. But this is still the cultural norm for many parts of the world. And by the way, it has a higher success rate for marriages than our current method, right? Because in America, the divorce rate is now above 50%. It's more than 50% at this point. And if you look at the divorce rate among arranged marriages, it's extremely low in comparison. So you can criticize it all you want, but it tends to work out. Now, at first, we talked about verse 8 where it says, if she does not please her master who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has broken faith with her. When you read that first portion of that scripture, it makes it look like it's the girl's fault that she wasn't pleasing, right? If she does not please her master who designated her for himself, right? But as you go on, the responsibility of it actually falls on the master, right? Because at the end it says, he has no right to sell her to a foreign people since he has broken faith with her. Whether or not he's pleased with the arrangement that he purchased is not her problem, right?
That version said since he dealt deceitfully with it.
Right. Basically, you gave your word to marry this girl, and if you go back on that word, right, she can be redeemed, but you can't just go sell her to anyone for your own profit. That's not how this is going to work.
And if nobody wants to redeem her, he's got to provide for her for the rest of her life.
That's right. She is his responsibility. So if no one can purchase her, you have to take care of her. And if you don't take care of her, she goes out for free. She has her freedom for nothing, right? And it continues on. If he has designated her as a wife for his son, he deals with her as a daughter, right? Even though she was purchased as a slave, if she marries his son, she's his daughter, right? Because once again, we constantly have this view of a slave as a shameful person, as a person who is ashamed and dejected and low. But that's not necessarily the case in this culture, right? Slavery was a means to an end, right? It was, and oftentimes was an honorable position. And so this man purchases a girl as a slave. That's no negative mark on her, because then why would he marry her to his daughter, to his son, right? A father wants his son to have a good wife. And so he finds a good wife. He buys her because he's like, that'll be a good wife for my son. She's admirable. And so he does that. It's developed into the practice of paying dowry for a girl and things of that nature, right? But once she is married to his son, he has to treat her as a daughter, because that's what she is now, right? You treat her as a daughter. And if after marrying the girl to himself, he then takes another wife, because polygamy was not another cultural norm, because the main concern, once again, was not love, but the carrying on of your line, right? And the growth of your family, because a large family meant you were wealthy, and your future was set. And so if he takes another wife to himself, he will by no means diminish her role as a wife, right? Regardless of how the other wife is attained, right? She is purchased. Let's say the next wife he marries out of love, right? Let's say he does that. Just because he marries the second wife out of love does not mean he has any right to diminish the marital rights of the first wife. We actually find this situation with Jacob, right? Because Jacob works for 7 years to essentially purchase Rachel. He's purchasing Rachel, who he loves. But the father-in-law does the old switcheroo and sneaks the other daughter in, because she's older and is apparently less likely to get a husband the normal way. It's kind of a weird thing.
You don't marry the younger.
Oh, that's right, because she's the older one, right? So he sneaks her in, Jacob marries her, not knowing because she didn't take off her veil or something. Weird situation. And then Jacob's like, "Hey, you tricked me," right? Interestingly, though, Jacob still honors the vow he made to this girl, even though he was deceived in it, which is kind of a tough thing. And then he works another 7 years for Rachel. So he works a total of 14 years to marry this woman that he loves. He loves Rachel. And we find that he ends up treating Leah not as good as he's treating Rachel. And that creates a lot of conflict. That creates, generations of conflict within the family.
Created immediately, and his oldest son slept with one of Jacob's concubines in order as retribution
Yeah.
against the way he treated. I mean, it was.
This is evidence that the Bible's filled with all kinds of stuff that the Bible does not recommend you doing. Right? People look at the Bible and they're like, "Hey, the Bible has all this stuff in it." I'm like, "Yeah, but the Bible's not telling you to do that." The Bible has it there just to tell you that happened and it wasn't good. So don't let that happen.
You mentioned the Psalms, even in Psalms.
Yeah.
That was David speaking his heart, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's what you should be doing.
My goodness. Right. And so if the husband does not provide the food, the clothing, the marital rights for this girl that he's agreed to purchase for this purpose, then she goes out for free without him being paid anything. He doesn't get any money back on this particular purchase. She goes out for free. Because he's failed in his obligations to her. And that's what people don't realize about slavery in the Bible, is that slavery, biblical slavery, is not this oppressive situation where the master gets to do whatever he wants and the slave has no rights, basically. Instead, the slavery in the Bible is generally a mutual agreement, wherein you give up ownership of yourself to me, but I now have obligations to you, right? And that's our relationship with God as well. We give up ownership of ourselves, and we hand that over to God and say, "Lord, not my will, but your will from now on," right? I give up all of my rights. I give up all the rights that I've ever claimed to myself. I give up the rights to my body, to my health, to my direction in life, to all of my behavior, even down to my thinking. Lord, I give ownership of myself to you. But with that, God now has an obligation to us, a willing obligation to us, which we do not have to press him on because he's a good master, right? And he's obliged to care for us. Seek first the kingdom, and all these things will be added to you, right? So that's more or less what we talked about through to verse 11, and now.